Hey everybody, I'm Joe, and around here we like to talk about monsters. Specifically, we talk about monsters for Dungeons and Dragons with an emphasis on 5th edition. And we talk about running monsters in combat. We talk about running them as a out-of-combat storytelling device, and we talk about homebrewing them. And today we're making a video for people looking at starting to homebrew monsters. When we want to homebrew a monster, we've got an idea for something, we know we're going to be placing it at our specific table, and the question is, how do we start generating the essential numbers on the stat block? Where do they come from for monsters? Because they are generated differently for monsters than for PCs. We have a wider range of challenge ratings that we're able to select from. And we also need to think about how much damage this monster is going to output during a single round of combat. So there are things that we take into consideration when developing a monster stat block that is different than the way that we develop a player character stat block. So that's what we are going to take a look at today. We're going to take a look at how we develop the essential statistics of a monster, and we're going to compare that system to a monster from the monster manual. Okay? Now, when you are building a monster for your game, there's one really key thing to look at. On page 274 of your Dungeon Master's Guide, there is a monster statistics chart. This tells you the essential numbers you need in order to start developing a monster for your table. Now we're going to be comparing that chart to a monster from the monster manual. On page 154 of the basic monster manual, we're going to look at the fire giant. We're going to take a look at how hit points, armor class, spell save DC, and damage per round are thought about and calculated for a challenge rating 9 monster. And we're going to use this information to understand how we begin developing our own homebrew monsters. So let's get into it. So you're going to want to reference the monster statistics by challenge rating chart that I referenced a second ago. This is going to be our guide to the essential numbers for the monster we want to create. We're going to reference this chart a lot in this video and in many other videos. So I have it pulled up here on D&D Beyond, but it is of course a part of your Dungeon Master's Guide. And we're going to be comparing this to the fire giant. I chose the fire giant because it is a pretty straightforward monster. It has a basic attack that it does. It's put together in a straightforward way with a couple small variations that will be interesting to look at. So when we look at a monster stat block, let's just take a look at what we see first. We have the name Fire Giant, and then we have a description right here, a huge giant that is lawful evil. Now, lawful evil is the alignment that tells you something about how to role play it, but what we actually care about is the huge giant part. The giant tells you the type of creature, and that's really important to know because there are spells that target or protect from certain types of creatures. And so knowing that this is a giant as opposed to an aberration is going to be important for us. Huge is its size, how big it is and how much space it takes up on a grid or a hex grid. And the huge indicator also tells us something about how hit points are calculated, which we're going to get into. That's going to be very important. But knowing its size tells you mechanically how you are going to generate the hit points. All right. Next, we have the armor class. This is, of course, very similar to armor class for PCs. We know the number and how it's generated. In this case, it's plate. We have the hit points, which we're going to come back to. The speed, in this case, it's 30. That is the most common. When in doubt, choose 30. Unless there's a reason to choose otherwise. And there might be different speeds. So for instance, you might have a flying speed or a burrowing speed. That would be worth talking about as well. And of course, we have its initiative roll. We have the statistics, the physical and mental stats, just like with a player character. The difference being that we, when we create monsters, have the ability to go above a 20. In this case, strength is a 25 and constitution is a 23. You have the ability to choose values all the way up to 30 if you want. We have the saving throws, but please note, the saving throws and skills in monster stat blocks are only ever listed if proficiency is added to them. The other ones you calculate just by adding the basic modifier from the abilities. We have damage immunities and resistances, senses, languages, the challenge rating, and the proficiency bonus, in this case a +4. We're going to get to the actions, which is going to be its attack. So let's take these a piece at a time. And I want to start with the monster statistics chart here. It goes from 0 all the way to 30 at the high end. And we can see the proficiency bonuses added in here, which for monsters can go all the way up to a +9. We then have defensive and offensive traits. So a couple things that we notice. First, the armor class and the spell save DC are generally speaking the same number. This eventually differentiates with high-level monsters. So for instance, right about here with challenge rating 21 monsters, the spell save DC and the armor class begin to diverge, as armor class is capped at 19 from this particular chart. The reason for that is actually psychological. It is profoundly disappointing to miss with an attack. And so it is preferred, generally speaking, to have a lower armor class and more hit points than the other way around. However, there are exceptions to that, and actually the Fire Giant is one of them. We have the hit points that it is going to want to have to be a reasonable challenge for a party of 4 players at the same level as the CR of the monster, which is how challenge rating is thought of. We have its attack bonus, the expected damage per round if all of its attacks hit, and of course, as I said, its spell save DC, which is generally speaking the same as armor class. This is done so that your ranged, melee, and spell attacks are basically the same in their ability to hit. That's the thought process, so that one's not preferred over another. So let's come to the hit points. We have a pool here of hit points, and this is Wizards of the Coast's understanding of how much damage a party at this appropriate level would be able to output. And a hit point value is then determined that would make sure that the creature doesn't, usually at least, die too quickly in combat. That's the idea. And of course, we've all experienced our players doing way more damage than anticipated and killing our monsters too fast. We've all had that experience. So we know that there is some inconsistencies, let's say, with hit points, but this is a good starting place. Now, how do we get to this number? Let's come over to the Fire Giant. There are a few different sizes of monsters in Dungeons & Dragons. Tiny, small, medium, large, huge, and gargantuan. And each one of those actually is determined by the hit dice used to roll for hit points. Or you could think of it the other way, that the actual size of the monster determines the hit dice. But a gargantuan uses d20s to roll for hit points. Huge rolls a d12. A large creature rolls a d10. A medium rolls a d8. Small rolls a d6. And tiny rolls a d4. This is, of course, different from player characters, where the class that you take determines the hit dice that you roll. A Fire Giant is a huge creature, which means it rolls d12s. There's always a modifier. In this case, it is 78. This is determined by multiplying the Constitution modifier against the number of hit dice rolled, not the challenge rating number of the monster. And that is another difference against generating a player character's statistics, where your Constitution modifier adds to hit points based on the levels that you have. In this case, it's the number of dice that are rolled. So how do we determine the number of dice rolled? Well, we kind of just make it up. When we thumb through monsters in the Monsters of the Multiverse or the Monster Manual, you'll find a number of different values of hit dice rolled for a particular monster, and there is pretty much no consistency. It's not based on challenge rating, it's not based on the size of the creature. It really is there to determine a number. So in this case, they were aiming for something in the 160s for the hit points. If we choose a 13 for the number of hit dice, it determines a plus 78, which is 13 times 6. And then that gave the developers 162 hit points, which they felt was appropriate. When I've developed monsters, I have determined the Constitution modifier first. That's going to be really key. And then the hit die is determined for me by the size, and I just start choosing a different number of dice to roll, and that will give me, using those calculations, the average hit points, and I increase the number of die rolled until I get a hit point number that is inside of the range from this chart. But let's actually go to challenge rating 9, and we're going to see that challenge rating 9 should have 191 to 205 hit points. Well, the Fire Giant has fewer. So let's take a look at that for a moment. First, it's 162, so that's fewer hit points, but the armor class is an 18. And the recommended armor class for challenge rating 9 is a 16. So here you have a monster that is harder to hit, but has fewer hit points. Those two things should theoretically balance out. That's going to be a key thing for us to think about. The next thing we want to take a look at is going to be the strength modifier, because we want to think about how hard this guy is going to hit. And we can choose almost anything that we want. We can go in strength values up to 30, knowing that every even number is going to add to our modifier. So when we choose this, what are we trying to accomplish? Well, we're really trying to accomplish a certain amount of damage output. So let's come over here and take a look at damage output expected per round. And in order to hit this, we need to think about all avenues of doing damage. Now, area of effect and breath weapons, these types of things confuse the damage per round numbers. So we think of this in terms of doing damage to probably 1 to 3 characters throughout a round of combat until we get to high-level monsters. So we know with a challenge rating 9 monster that we want to hit something like 57 to 62 damage per round. All right, so how are we going to do that? We're going to have a weapon that does a d6 of damage, but it's going to roll 6d6 with the particular weapon that we have, and then it's plus 7. It's plus 7 because the strength modifier is a plus 7, and we have 11 to hit. So this expects an individual hit to be 28, and we make 2 of them, which adds up to 56. Now, if you were paying attention a moment ago, you saw that at challenge rating 9, that's actually low for this challenge rating. We expect 57 to 62. So what's going on there? What's going on is we have a greater to hit modifier than is expected. And since we will hit more often, the damage can be a little bit lower. This has a plus 11 to hit when we actually only expect a plus 7 to hit. Now, if we take a look at that, this means that a challenge rating 9 monster with a plus 4 for proficiency is really only expected to have a plus 3 for its to hit statistic. But when you take a look at a fire giant, something that's supposed to be a huge creature, it just doesn't make sense for it to only have a 17 strength. It needs to have a high number. So they went with 25, a nice large number, stronger than a player character can be, which of course, being a +7, made the to-hit bonus +11. That is going to be something they had to compensate for because this monster is going to hit more often than not with a +11 to hit bonus. As a result, they made sure that the damage that it did was slightly lower than was expected. Now, of course, instead of making 2 greatsword attacks, it could do a rock attack, which is its only ranged attack, and it only gets to do 1 on a turn. And that means that for those turns, it's doing 29 damage, which is lower than average. So this guy is going to hit a little bit less hard than we might expect, but it's going to do so more often. And those things kind of balance against each other. So that's the idea. When we take a look at our saving throws and skills, they're exactly the same as they would be for player characters, except that with monsters, they only list saving throws and skills they are proficient in. So of course, each one of these comes from adding the proficiency bonus to the appropriate skill, strength, dexterity, constitution, that the fire giant has. And that's why athletics is +11 and perception is +6, etc. So that gives you an idea of where these numbers come from. When we're creating spellcasters, we're taking a look at spell save DCs, and this gives us an idea of what spells that we can start doing. In a later video, I'm going to take a look at area of effect monsters and higher level monsters that are going to start messing with this idea of the damage per round and how we should think about this with monsters with area effect and breath weapons. So this has been a look at how we generate the essential numbers for our monster stat block. Not all of them, but the essential working pieces to start with. That's going to be really powerful for us. I hope this has been useful for you. I hope this helps you generate interesting monsters for your table. Have fun with it. Tell me about the homebrew monsters that you've developed. I'd love to hear about them. And until next time, enjoy your games and take care.